as we were talking about getting ready for this session, we were thinking about how to be a little bit sort of meta themes, but how to be quite specific and practical as we face the prospect of a new administration. And so I took David to heart and decided I would put my presentation in the form of a presidential briefing. So if you'll bear with me, I'll share with you the reflections that I would share with President Ryan. Mr. President, our clean energy innovation economy is being mangled by a maze of mandates and is idling through an idiocracy of incentives. Our investors and innovators are awash in a tidal wave of rent-seeking, crony capitalism, and moral hazard. Your administration can and must get the government out of what it does badly and abandon what is now an utterly permission-based clean energy economy. Your administration should focus the government on what it must and does do very well, while unleashing the market to do what it must and does do very well. If we do this right, on a bipartisan basis, we can deliver a strong and growing economy that will have the resources to produce more clean energy, much faster, and at a significantly lower cost, and with a lot more American jobs and a lot fewer American lawyers. Be both big and bold and small and humble. So here's the situation, and here's a few recommendations. First, since 1998, the United States has put in place more than 100 federal and state mandates directed either directly or indirectly at abating greenhouse gases and air pollution. Interestingly, this has been action occurring at the federal level and the state level, and notwithstanding many in our party, at least 6 of the most consequential of these mandates were market-based, dare I say, cap and trade. Of all of these major market-based and, dare I say, cap and trade mandates, Republicans were in substantial majorities in voting in favor of these solutions. On the other side of the ledger is over $150 billion of incentives. Now, I don't know about you, Mr. President, but when you've incentivized everything, it seems to me you've incentivized nothing. You're just making a transfer payment from the tax side of the ledger to the grant side of the ledger, and everybody's benefiting, but nothing actually is additionally being accomplished. Now, as we look forward to what to do with this, how we look back on what we've got and how we translate to what we need to understand that regardless how you feel, or either end of the party feels, or either end of the Democratic Party feels, what's on the table right now is the prospect of trying to abate 60 gigatons of projected greenhouse gas emissions. Now, I'm kind of simple. I like to think straightforward about these things. I don't actually know what 60 gigatons means. There's an incredible innumeracy to this climate change question. Nobody understands the scale, so I tried to break it down in a very practical way. So if I have to find 60 gigatons of avoided emissions each year between now and 2050, I need to break it down to its pieces. So what's 1 gigaton? So to help you understand, Mr. President, what 1 gigaton is 507 coal-fired power plants with carbon capture and storage. That's 10% of the installed base of coal today, large coal-fired power plants today, and today, for all practical effect, we have 0 examples of it. It's 1,000 geologic sequestration projects, like Norway's Sleipner project. We have 3 of those today, sir, so that's encouraging. We need 300 times more. Natural gas combined cycle, great technology, cheap gas. I need 608 of those just to get 1 gigaton. So that's 10% of the current installed capacity. So I've got to do that a few times over. Efficiency. We had great success. George W. Bush and Nancy Pelosi taking the stage with the most consequential vehicle fuel efficiency mandate in the history of the world. We have to do that a few more times. You have to take 290 million cars, take them 20 miles per gallon more efficient. That's all the cars in China, and actually more than all the cars in the US or the EU. Wind energy is the same. You need 165,000 2-megawatt turbines. That's 2 to 3 times the current installed capacity. So that looks like a nice slug to go after. Concentrated solar, I need 1,100 of those. That's 300 times our current experience. Landfill gas, I need 7,700 of those. Solar voltaics, give me the state of Washington. Solar voltaics, give me 100 times the current installed amount of solar voltaics, and I get 1 of the 60 I need. And then on CO2 storage and new forest, give me the entire state of Washington, make it a desert, turn it into a forest of Douglas fir trees, and I've accomplished 1 gigaton of emissions. So this is big, it's consequential, it's hard. It is doable, but we have to understand the scale to accomplish it. So, how do we get there? We have to get there by getting everybody on the same page to the extent we can. We need solutions that are scalable. The solutions need to be market-driven as much as possible. They need to be common ground. And I think it really should be bold, Mr. President, and start at the top. The political divide over this issue will not be addressed until we straight up have a legislative debate and vote on how far, how fast we want to go with our greenhouse gas emissions trajectory. And do nothing else. Have the debate. Pick the number. Is it the number from Paris? Is it 20% less than the number Paris? Is it 10% more than the number at Paris? I actually don't have a recommendation because as a market-driven guy, what I care most about is the numbers going down, and substantially. Because if you implement the policies that I would recommend to you today, sir, as long as it's going down substantially, we know, based on prior experience with these kinds of policies, that the American innovators and the regulators and the academics are going to deliver the surprising solutions at scale that we never thought imaginable. Just think of the acid rain trading program from 1990, in which nobody predicted the method by which that was ultimately achieved, and it came in at half the cost that we thought. We can do that again and again and again if we unleash innovators to do what they do well and stop having them wait to get permission to do so. So, if I have one policy to recommend to you, sir, and there was an incredible debate earlier today among a prior set of panelists at a conference I attended, make electricity markets competitive. Quarantine the monopoly in the electricity system to the distribution wires and unleash the rest. One of the biggest impediments to capital planning and investment and introduction of new technology and its relationship then into transportation and into agriculture is our Byzantine, outdated, obsolete system of 2,500 utilities, most of them regulated monopolies. You need to allow the big guys to consolidate so they have the scale to invest at the scale we need. You need to carve out the middle, and you need to unleash tens of thousands of providers that can now compete to put their wares into those systems. Second, how do you do that? Well, I have to say, as someone who fought for years to try to do it through a regulatory process and failed, that's not going to work. As someone who fought for decades to try to do this through state or federal legislation, and that failed, it's not going to work. I hate to tell you, sir, but this is the one time when lawyers are a good thing. File the lawsuit. The current electricity system is a de facto violation of the Constitution's Interstate Commerce Clause. So be done with it and watch what happens. Second, simplify power generation mandates. You saw the list. Renewable portfolio standards, the Clean Power Plan, the regional state initiatives, all of the building efficiency standards that deal with energy. We have so many mandates, and if I line them all up, I could show to you, sir, that almost all of them overlap, and in many instances, many of them compete with each other. Think of the case, sir, of wind at night putting nuclear out of business. Makes no sense. Related to renewable portfolio standards, and then pushing a zero-emission source out while we're trying to encourage a new zero-emission source. They should be doubling together, not one subtracting from the other. Also, to simplify the mandates, we know how to do it because we've done it in pretty much every other sector and regulatory system. It needs to be technology neutral, performance-based, have a cap on costs. So, sir, be free to take on those, who agree with those who say this will cost less than you think it can. And many of my friends in the environmental community say that. I believe that, in which case they should be perfectly okay with putting a cap on runaway cost. We do that in every other environmental statute that's been enacted since 1970. There's no reason why we can't be sure that we don't do something stupid to the economy if you do it right, because I believe it'll come in at less cost. In addition, we got to preempt all the overlapping mandates. If you want to, suspend them. But we need one set of objectives to work against, one system of making economic decisions to work against. Otherwise, you will not get the speed you desire. When you do that, you unleash innovation in natural gas, you unleash innovation in clean coal, you unleash the opportunity for nuclear and hydro, and renewables just gets a giant boost because it no longer has to guess when it's valuable and when it's not valuable. Third, simplify the transportation mandates. On a bipartisan basis, Democrats and Republicans came together to improve CAFE by making it a little more market-based than it was before. Take the last step. Set up a fee-based system. We don't know. You want to look forward to innovation, not have the regulators looking in the rearview mirror decide what the efficiency level should be. So take the bold step. Move to a fee-based system and let the private sector figure out who wants to be the best each year, rather than have the government tell you what the best solution is. Same thing with fuels. We've made great strides with still a little bit of crony capitalism tied into the renewable fuel standard. You may recall, sir, that President George W. Bush wanted an alternative fuel standard. Technology neutral, weighted for national security, for energy density, and for emissions profile. That's still an option on the table, make it a lot easier to plan, and then we don't need to worry about what the right choice is. Let the market figure out how we get the lowest emissions with the highest security and the greatest energy density. Now, let's think about some role for government. So get the government out of saying what and where and when, just tell me how much. On the other side, it's very clear that we cannot have a sustainable long-term solution to climate change and to choking air pollution in developing countries unless we restore the place of nuclear energy and dramatically expand it. There is no better combination in most parts of the world than the combination of cycling nuclear power plants plus renewables. So, sir, the farmers and the cowhands must be friends. If we can get them together, they can accomplish more together at a lower total cost to customers in the economy. But that's going to require some government, because that's big infrastructure. That's a non-market challenge. It's going to require everyone to come together, say, we want to make it be part of the mix, and then let it compete into these market-based mandates that I discussed. There's a place, sir, that I come from, Silicon Valley, which has some of the brightest software engineers, electrical engineers, and academic institutions in the entire world. They have developed systems for every other sector that helps us completely understand what's going on within them. It helps us see into a level of efficiency that was just unimaginable before. This is a good place for the government, through its public utility commissions, to require the utility system to invest in their own success and deploy these systems to achieve a 25% efficiency gain in the entire power system. It cannot be done without these innovations. The utility structure today is incapable of absorbing them. 25% net economic savings to the entire cost of electricity in America is not something you can ignore if you want U.S. economic growth and global economic growth. And then finally, if we've subsidized everything and subsidized nothing, I do have a pot of about $150 billion to use. So let's take that $150 billion that's being used today to pay for technologies that are already proven and exist and are already subject to the mandates we just talked about. And why don't we take half of that and quintuple the federal R&D budget and put the other half of that to pay down the debt? Now, that's a winning combination that you can get conservatives and liberals alike to agree on. Related to that, then, let's take a look at where the real money is in the economy. And the real money is the amount of money that is not being taxed. Everything I've told you is small in relation to the capital that would be available for new investments in clean energy if we slash the corporate income tax rate, if we provide for 100% expensing on new capital equipment purchases to drive out old, less efficient technology, and if we repatriate the trillions of dollars that Americans' leading energy innovators have parked overseas and are not allowed by the fiduciary responsibility of their boards and of corporate law to bring back to America and reinvest in the American clean energy system. If you do this, you're either going to inspire or scare China and India into doing the same, which is the final and essential requirement of a sensible clean energy strategy, because we cannot impose costs on ourselves such that we simply move our emissions over there. Certainly we can all agree that a policy that takes emissions from here and increases them over there is something no one wants. So let's do this in a way that gets them on board and excited about what we're doing. Thank you, sir. I look forward to your questions.
So David giving us the mandate to talk about everything that had not been talked about today before we knew what would be talked about today was challenging. And at least 5 of you in the room have either emailed or texted me about things you think I should talk about since you didn't think they were sufficiently talked about today. So luckily, Jim just talked about basically everything, so I think that we're covered. But I want to take the chance to talk about something that is underpinning most of what we've heard today, which is infrastructure. Both public and private sector infrastructure, something that is, I think, inherently nonpartisan. And that's an important space to be in right now. This has become an extremely partisan conversation. Getting to nonpartisan conversations and issues is really, really important to move anything forward, going forward, regardless of the makeup of the presidency and the Congress. It is also something that underpins, again, everything we do on the government side and on the private sector side, so it can make a big difference. So what do we mean about infrastructure? It's a big topic. Most of you know that I was involved with, others in this room actually, there's some of the risky business team in this room. Jameson Rogers is here. I saw Matt James earlier. Risky Business, which came out in 2014, the first report, was an attempt co-chaired by my current boss, Hank Paulson, along with Tom Steyer and Mike Bloomberg, to calculate the physical economic risk from climate change. And that's something we have not talked about a lot today. We have not talked a lot about risk and resilience today. Physical climate risk, heat, sea level rise. This is one of the sets of many, many, many maps from Risky Business, but basically shows somebody's lifetime and what happens over the course of the lifetime through the end of the century to the United States by county. In terms of heat impacts, we talk here about number of days over 95 degrees Fahrenheit, and just to pile on what Jim said, we use Fahrenheit here in the US, and when you're talking to people in the country, in different sectors and different regions, use Fahrenheit, because it is, in fact, the unit of measurement here in the United States. It does tend to resonate more with people. So we used Fahrenheit and used these maps to show sort of what heat impacts there are across the country. We have these results by region, we have them by sector. Taking these results around the country, we did several follow-up reports of different sectors. Taking these reports around the country, I have now had, and my team has had, hundreds of conversations with business leaders, with investors, and the co-chairs have had with CEOs. And I will tell you, this framework, risk, physical climate risk to people's supply chains and investments, is a way to have a nonpartisan conversation about the risk of climate. It is, you can get people past acceptance of the science, sort of as Mr. Schultz was talking about earlier, in terms of, you don't have to say, I totally believe everything you're saying, you just have to admit there's a risk. Get past the science, get to the risk evaluation, you're automatically in a conversation about climate change, without having to fight over the science, which is very, very useful. It also gets you very quickly into a conversation about what you do about it. These are business leaders that have done risk assessment their whole lives. This is what they do. They do risk of terrorism, risk of war, risk of extreme weather events. They know how to evaluate risk. They know how to think beyond risk to solutions. It gets you in the door on a conversation about solutions. And yes, you're doing it through an adaptation framework or a resilience framework and not a mitigation framework, but I will tell you it gets you to a mitigation framework. And I'll talk a little bit about why. So does it change individual corporate behavior? Yes. Yes, it does. And that's really important because some of these corporations are really big. But it does that, and I think it has the potential, talking about risk, using this framework has the potential to fundamentally change our approach to investment in infrastructure, to capital stock turnover investment, to supply chains, to the underpinnings of our entire economic system. And that's fundamental change in our economy. The kinds of subsidies and policies and investments that Nancy was talking about earlier that have been made over the last 200 years have created the current infrastructure that's the fundamental underpinning of our economy. We are now in a position to create the next fundamental underpinning of our economy. So consider the opportunity here. You've all seen this, I'm sure. This is the report card, the infamous report card from the American Association of Engineers on how bad our infrastructure is in this country. It's bad. Mostly D's and C's, and I think there's one B- on solid waste is the winner here on this chart. Solid waste probably doesn't get that very often, so they're probably happy about that. But I like this chart better because this is about the gaps. This is about what's being spent now and where the gaps are in terms of upgrading our infrastructure. Now, as a glass half full kind of person, most people look at this and they say, oh no, the gaps, how will we pay? And I look at that and I say, look at all that money that we're spending, and all of it could be spent so much better. This is a great opportunity. You can look at the gaps here and you can see potential for spending more in a more intelligent way on rail, on roads, on schools, something I care a lot about, getting to work on Prop 39 here in California, on electricity, we've heard a lot about in this conversation, on dams, on waterways. We have an opportunity to upgrade and replace and retool this public sector infrastructure and some private, using a framework that actually incorporates climate risk analysis. Are these things being built in areas that are safe, given the numbers that we know and we know what's going to happen to the heat systems and to the sea level rise and to the climate, to precipitation? But also, are they being built so that they can help decarbonize the economy and bring that risk down? And by decarbonize, I do mean carbon removal as well as lower carbon emissions. Carbon removal is a critical part of this conversation. An example from the energy sector, a personal example from the Risky Business Initiative. We spend a lot of time talking about heat. You saw those maps. Increased heat means two things in the electricity sector. This is very dumbed down. I'm cognizant of Secretary Chu being in the front row here and saying this in a very untechnical way, but essentially increased heat, your power plant gets less efficient, works less well, your transmission lines transmit less well, and people use a lot more electricity. So supply goes down, demand goes up. Our research shows about 95 gigawatts of new energy demand just from heat increases from climate change by 2040 in this country. So you go into a utility or you go into a transmission distribution conversation talking about these heat increases and risks, it immediately leads to the question of how do you meet that power demand? That immediately leads to the question of lower carbon and more distributed systems that are less risky and will help mitigate the problem as they help solve for the problem. So that's just one example. There are examples like that from every region and every sector of this country. And that's why it's exciting. This is a conversation you can have with just about any industry. We are starting to see some good examples in the policy arena in dealing with this and starting to integrate these risks into budgeting. The 2016 federal budget had new flood standards, you probably saw this, that required resilience in all projects built in floodplains. That means every single project from any agency, whether it's HUD, whether it's HHS, whether it's the farm agency, any project built in a floodplain now built differently. That is a significant impact on our economy. We saw just on April 22nd, the Federal Highway Administration put out a notice of proposed rulemaking, you may have seen this, to include performance metrics on GHGs in highway standards. That's a significant change to how we build highways, significant change to our economy if that goes through. We need to do more of that, and the first thing I'll say on this panel is infrastructure bill. An infrastructure bill is something I believe could get through Congress. It's something that the private sector is deeply behind because these are the infrastructure that moves their stuff, and it's something that both sides of the aisle have talked about. It's something that could include climate risk and decarbonization standards and could fundamentally change how we think about infrastructure, and ultimately those tentacles reach out and can change how we do economic growth. On the private sector side, there's a lot of capital stock turnover happening. Capital stock turnover, so people's fleets of cars, their manufacturing plants, their equipment, their supply chains, their fixed assets. These things move, it's about 12-year average of how quickly these things move, some much slower, some much faster. I'm happy to say that the Risky Business Project, which still exists, is looking at this issue And stay tuned on that, because that's the next thing we're looking at. But there is a lot of capital stock turnover in this country and developed countries, and there's also a need for a lot of new capital stock in developing countries. And this is a slide I like because it shows you that it's sort of like a how steel equals urbanization slide. We here in the US, if you look at the US line, this is essentially all the steel we use in our current economy. So steel per capita in the economy today, in what we've already built up and what we continue to use, we're sort of flattening out. You look at countries that are less developed, particularly look at China and India here, they are urbanizing quickly, they are building quickly. Those buildings, those systems use a lot of steel. You could have the same chart for concrete, you could have this same chart for any number of commodities that are sort of the underpinning of our economic system. I would like to see steel built more efficiently and actually ultimately to sequester carbon. I would like to see more recycled steel. I would like to see more carbon sequestering concrete, but the fact is that we use a lot of these systems. There's a lot being built in developing countries. There's a lot being replaced here in the United States. This is a great opportunity for us to think about how we build better. And how do you do that? Well, first of all, why do you do that? Why are those industries, why are those old school industries that we don't usually talk about in Silicon Valley important? They're energy intensive, so they are the problem, but they can be part of the solution. They're multinational, which means they're global influencers, which means they operate both at a local level in terms of their climate impact and at a global level in terms of policy. They have a lot of influence on policymakers, and they are job creators, particularly in manufacturing, but also construction. But this manufacturing slide is just an example of why we like manufacturing jobs. They have a big multiplier effect. They create a lot of middle-skilled jobs. They are the kind of jobs that people leaving things like the coal sector, not necessarily the miners, but leaving some things like the coal power plant sector may be actually able to be retrained to do. So we like these kinds of jobs. So essentially, we have this great opportunity to have private sector, public sector infrastructure changed in a way that incorporates these climate risk ideas and incorporates climate strategy. This is already happening on the private sector side, despite the Asset Owners Disclosure Project report you may have seen last week or 2 weeks ago saying that half of the biggest 500 global investors don't care about climate risk. That is dispiriting, but half of them do, and in fact, we're starting to see more and more movement in this regard. Co-chair of Risky Business, Mike Bloomberg, is running the Climate Disclosure Standards Board. They're starting to look at ways to disclose climate risk in the private sector. The Institutional Investment Network is working with endowments and pension funds and big investors to think about portfolio diversification to deal with climate risk and carbonization. Big multinationals, I can tell you, having worked with them, but you probably know, are actually doing climate risk analysis in-house and making decisions based on that. Happy to say CalPERS here in California was rated AAA by Asset Owner Disclosure Project for how well it's doing climate risk disclosure. So it's happening a little, but the government, in terms of government role, and I'll end on this, the government can do a lot, the president can do a lot to push this forward. We can, of course, keep regulations that are smart regulations, to Jim's point. We can keep things in place that help move capital stock turnover faster. The CAFE standards, Clean Power Plan, methane standards for natural gas, industrial efficiency. Some of these standards done well can move capital stock turnover. We can see SEC disclosure of climate risk actually enforced. Technically, climate risk is a material risk to companies. Mostly it's not enforced as a disclosure. We can look for better disclosure on risk because disclosure by companies does in fact lead to risk analysis and change in behavior. We can incorporate risk into federal contracting. We can make sure our federal contracts are not paying for stuff that is risky and that is high carbon. We can actually incorporate some of these standards just in the way the federal budget did with the floodplains. We can use development banks to start pushing some better investment to those developing countries that are building all this new stuff that has to be built better than we built it when we did it. We have got to push for leapfrogging and for better technology in those countries. And to Nancy Fund's point, we can see much better data and transparency from the federal government. Just to know, I mean, one of the big problems with climate risk disclosure is no one knows how to measure it. It's very, very hard to measure. We used 20 terabytes of data on the Risky Business Project, and we only looked at 4 industries. It's very, very data intensive to do this at the level you need to if you are a company and you actually need information. So you might ask, why won't all these companies with all this stuff that I'm imposing on them just move to other countries? Why won't they just leave? two things that are different than they were before. One, climate risk is a bigger deal in the global south than it is here. You want to move your manufacturing plant to a place that has even worse sea level risk than we have here, good luck. Other countries are looking at these risks and experiencing them today. So that's going to affect your 5-year investment, not your 40-year investment in some places in the global south. But more important, we now have a global framework on climate change. That was not true before. It is true now. Other countries are also putting emissions reductions into place, are also thinking about some of these ideas. So all of this can sound, especially in Silicon Valley, sort of like an old economy conversation. Why are we talking about big multinational manufacturing firms and infrastructure? Well, ultimately, this is the stuff that underpins our economy. This is the stuff that underpins the new economy, just as it did the old economy. This is what we have to do right in order to move an economy that's actually going to serve us for the future. So I will leave it there and look forward to a conversation about how we actually do it. Thanks.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk about two things we haven't talked a lot about today, land use and conservation. So my first chart is the global greenhouse gas emissions by economic sector. And we've got all the usual suspects here, electricity and heat production, transportation, industry. But look, 1/4 of the global emissions are coming from agriculture, forestry, and other land use. Now we're talking about emissions here. So we're talking about forestry, we're actually talking about deforestation. We're talking about emissions from humongous clearing of mostly tropical forests. Some of our most important biodiverse areas in the world, and wiping out indigenous people's livelihoods, and there is nothing good about this. And it is enormous, and it is not part of many conversations. I'm going to get to why and maybe why that has to change. But remember last September, the peat and forest fires in Indonesia that blanketed that entire part of the world? In one single day in September, just virtually every day in September and into October, the emissions from one day's fires in Indonesia matched the entire U.S. greenhouse gas emissions on that day in the United States. The United States, by far, the largest greenhouse gas emitter. So there's that global deforestation piece of it. Now, hold that thought a minute, because there's another part of the natural system that we don't talk a lot about, which is that when forests and landscapes are healthy, they drink in carbon. In fact, they can overcome emissions and are largely actually buffering now, having a harder and harder time doing it, but buffering now are aggressive over emissions globally. Now it's a cartoon, but you can get a little sense if you can see those numbers. Look on the right, the fossil fuels and cement production. This is global, compared to what's going on the left, which is the emissions from forests and soils and forest fires, et cetera. And then on the left side, the tremendous absorption of carbon and sequestration of carbon in soils and forests. Look at those numbers. They are huge. And in the middle to the right, you see in healthy forests, you get actually increased bonus points and more sequestration in not insubstantial amounts. This is obviously a cartoon, but it is in fact true. And here in the United States, for example, our forests, thankfully, have been relatively healthy lately, actually for some time. And in fact, our forests and our landscapes generally drink in and cover about 13% of our overall emissions. We are a sink. Now, there's concern that we may not be a sink if we do not continue to have healthy forests going ahead. But on the on the positive side of that, there's some really good news here if we have policies that recognize the potential enormous value of using our natural systems to absorb more carbon. We call that around here, Stanford, natural capital, because this can be just as significant in terms of capital, namely our natural landscapes, as investment capital in the latest techno-geeky thing is. But it requires continued investment. Now, the U.S. Geological Survey was asked from the 2007 energy bill that Jim was involved in to do a nationwide analysis of our land types and our overall sequestration capacity in the United States. And they spent, during my time at the Interior Department, about $40 million doing amazing work here. And they have characterized the absorptive capacity of our entire nation, every region. If you're having a hard time sleeping at night, just pull up one of these reports. I'll give you a couple of interesting points, though. They estimate that our public lands, and about 25% of the United States landmass are public lands, already store 11.6 billion metric tons of carbon, and that they project that with good stewardship, they could store another 2 billion tons, just our public lands. Just to give another little feel for how big an issue this can be, Tom Vilsack, last February, made an announcement on behalf of the USDA that he was going to introduce and has introduced a variety of voluntary programs for the ag community and for the forestry community that he believes, again, these are sort of voluntary, kind of low-price programs, everything from agricultural digesters to conserving threatened but very productive wetlands and forests. He predicts that by 2025, this will account for 2% of our U.S. emissions. Now, you move the needle, trying to move the needle 2% of any of our emissions in sort of a technical sense, a non-nature sense, you're talking a lot of money. Here, it's a modest amount of money. There are other examples, too. Now, the other thing is there are some co-benefits here. Healthy forests, healthy landscapes not only drink in more carbon, but they also provide more resilience to climate change. You look at what's happening in the San Francisco Bay and the money that's going in to restore the wetlands that you fly over on your way into SFO. That's a wonderful hedge against sea rise and storm surge. We are finding that natural systems are some of the best ways to deal with sea rise and storm surge. When it comes to issues like the impact of drought on forests, the need for clean water from forests. If we have healthy systems, it's going to be more. Our forests are going to be more resilient. So why aren't we talking about this more? And why aren't we looking at the enormous gigaton opportunities on the climate change side? I think we need to, and I think our next president has a wonderful opportunity to do it. Why aren't we? Well, there aren't any good reasons why we're not, actually, but I'll posit a few. One is our government is not unified on this. EPA does their thing when it comes to evaluating carbon sinks. The Forest Service does their thing when it comes to carbon sinks. The United States Geological Survey, part of the Department of the Interior, with their $40 million, has done a completely separate thing. The reality is that we do not invest in some of the basics of how to characterize, define, and evaluate and monitor. This is hard. These natural systems are hard to do that on, but we are not really trying very hard. And the benefits potentially are huge. So what would I have the president do on this set of issues? First, I would say the president should celebrate, document, and disclose the key role that America's forests, parks, grasslands, and natural landscapes play in protecting the planet against carbon pollution. This is something we should all be proud of and know about it. And we should congratulate our forest owners, public and private, and our farmers and ranchers that are doing the right thing and having good soil management practices and keeping that carbon in the soil, and for the good work they're doing, and give them the tools to do more. You don't hear much about that today. We should be talking more about it. Number 2, quantify the benefit. Force the experts together. Stop this stuff of 3 agencies taking 3 different methodologies. Force them to do a unified methodology for measurement and monitoring and get on with it. Third, encourage more investment and experimentation in enhancing carbon absorption in our landscapes. Make a market here. So Chevrolet, as part of General Motors, did an investment in the Prairie Pothole region last year to save some grasslands that were about to be converted and lost, and they got a big carbon credit for it, and lots of co-benefits. You're starting to see a market. And finally, join with the international community here and save the world's great forests. That emissions number has got to come down. That's mostly not here. And we all love forests. We know they're the Earth's lungs, astonishing biodiversity. In Paris, there was an underscoring of the importance of forestry and land use in the climate change world. In fact, for much of the developing world, their goals are all about land use and forestry. So let's get on with it, and let's create the market. While I'm on this subject, and I will move on quickly in a minute, I want to talk a little bit more about adaptation, because it's related here. And Kate mentioned it in the infrastructure context. There's a huge necessity that in the context of our natural resources, we also get our act together when it comes to adaptation. And this is going to be a challenge for the next president, because adaptation issues arise on a regional basis. They're about places. Not every place is Miami, where you're going to have water in the streets. But there is a Miami, and there are other communities like that. And one of the things the federal government has a big stake in this, as the largest water manager in the country, as the largest landowner in the country, as the wildlife manager for endangered species. So, hello again, federal agencies, stop acting like children and developing your own programs. We're going to do this in the right way together. And we'll all be better for it. The other piece of it, and there's a publication that came out today, I think it's available outside, that talked about 5 or actually 6 different climate change initiatives by the Obama administration, 1 by Jerry Brown. And it talked about the challenge that the natural resource agencies have had in coming together. It's an example of how not to do interagency work. The brighter side is that we have wonderful new technology to help with measurement and monitoring, namely the GIS mapping and data capability and mashing together that's available now. But again, our federal government, and that's how our federal government could probably help the most, the local folks in the region, not to supply the answer, but to supply the data, to have everyone understand what's going on and what can be done about it. Okay, I'm going to talk now about just a couple other things. This is a reminder, this chart, of the reality. You know, we've been talking a lot about renewable energy. It's only 10% of today's energy supply. We've been talking a lot about solar and wind. Look at that. It's 20% of 10%. We've still got a big issue with coal, natural gas, and petroleum. And there are some land use issues around them. Coal. 40% of the coal provided in the United States comes from the federal lands. You and I own that. We have a decision to make. Should we continue to provide that coal to the market at what has been pretty clearly very cheap prices? Should we, in fact, think about, as the landowner and as folks who are worried about this, about raising the price? and recognizing also that the prices do not include the real cost of coal, which includes those implications of the climate impacts that are not being captured by the market. Important questions for the next president. In the oil and gas space, methane, that's the big story. We haven't talked about it today. You all know how central it is. It is 16% of the global greenhouse gas emissions are methane, but you know that's at least 25% more powerful than carbon dioxide. So it's an outsized 16%. And as we have grown our economy with natural gas, we are finding methane everywhere. And we've got some of the best work in the country is going on right here with Rob Jackson and his finding of 6,000 methane leaks in Washington, D.C. I just want to know where they are. Boston, same thing. We've got the huge leak down in L.A., which by itself doubled the methane emission rate in the entire L.A. region. Now, so we've got things going there in terms of dealing with the land use issues and how we do our oil and gas production, how we do our infrastructure distribution. The next president's got to deal with that too. I should also say parenthetically, the other land use side of methane is livestock and nitrous oxide fertilizers. And you saw that, remember that first slide, quarter of our world's emissions are from forestry and ag. We have to help farmers. They want to do the right thing. We have to find the way to have a market for digesters that works. We have technology, we can do it. Final thing is renewables, because there's a land use play here too. The thing about renewables that is amazing in some respect is and this is Tom Kiernan's slide from the Wind Energy Association, but because I respect Tom so much, I believe it. Look at the price has gone down, and look at the opportunities that have gone up. We have technology right now that is utility scale, ready to go. One of the barriers of it is getting it deployed. And we heard earlier about some of the techniques used to get it deployed in terms of incentives, et cetera, tax, et cetera. Well, one of the big issues is siting. It's really hard to site wind and solar projects. And some of that makes sense, some of it doesn't. And one of the reasons why some of the problems are there in terms of siting is because you have every unit of government from the smallest to the largest dealing with this new thing. And they're not very good at working together, at making, recognizing the business proposition, recognizing and sort of making the permitting system work. I will say on that paper that you will see, I hope you will read, there are some good examples of how that can be done. And in fact, I think the Obama administration in the first term and the Interior Department in pushing through 16,000 megawatts of siting on public lands did some of the things that we want the next president to do. But we need to do more. You've got transmission siting, you've got big footprint project siting, and you do have impacts. And that we got to make good decisions, but we need to do it efficiently and with a recognition that that we need to get to the merits of the question and not let the process hold us back. So I'll stop there, and we're going to do a couple of rounds of Q&A here. Thank you. The three of us are going to step back and talk about a cacophony of other issues that we think should be on the president's agenda as the next president takes office. And we're not looking to give a laundry list of to-dos. The whole idea of this conference actually is to try to elevate a little bit and think kind of broader picture so that climate change and these issues don't feel or look like they're not central to our economy and to our society. And then after we're each going to talk for 10 or 12 minutes, and then we're going to have a dialogue among the three of us. And one of the things I hope we'll talk about is kind of the governance question, because this is such a difficult issue for a president to execute on, given how central a number of these issues are in terms of governing. And how do you put together a new administration effectively in that regard? I think we've we've got some interesting perspectives there. So let me quickly introduce Jim Connaughton and Kate Gordon. Their bios are on the conference website, so per usual, I'm going to give them a little bit shorter shrift than they deserve. For Jim and I crossed paths many years ago as young environmental lawyers, cutting our teeth on the Clean Air Act, and I guess here we are again. But
You kept your hair.
yeah, it used to be brown, though. Both of you talked about, in different ways, the incredible diversity of sectors of the economy that are impacted by what we're talking about today, and the need for coordination and sort of everyone falling in line in terms of trying to row in the right direction. How can the next president effectively set up the White House and the agencies to avoid what is increasingly the common challenge that government has, which are so many cooks at the White House potentially, and certainly a lot of agencies that may, particularly on a shiny object program like this, may go their own way?
Well, it's a great question and the question. This is a multi-sector, economy-wide issue, right? And, I've spent a lot of time coordinating people, right? Whether it was getting labor and environment and business together at the Apollo Alliance or getting all these, former secretaries of things together with the Risky Business Project. And often as the youngest, sadly not anymore the youngest person in the room, I used to be, but often the only woman in the room. And so I'm often in the note-taker role. And what I've learned in this role is that there's a lot of power being the facilitator. You can actually shape a conversation as the facilitator. And so I think it's an interesting moment. Jennifer Granholm talked about this as well, for the White House for sure to take a role of coordinating the conversation, not just bringing people together physically, but actually actively coordinating a conversation to figure out, to look at all these programs, look across all these agencies, figure out where the levers are, and try to find those common points of intersection. The other thing I would say about this is that, and this is a plug for my favorite agency, the Department of Commerce sort of is the youngest person in the room, right? And often in the note-taker role. And I think Commerce has a real opportunity here. I'm going to put in a plug for the Department of Commerce as a coordinating agency. They have the Economic Development Administration, so they're already cross-sector, they're already cross-region. They have people operating below the state level all over the country. They have the Manufacturing Extension Partnership doing technical support to manufacturing. They have the Small Business Administration, and they have the NASA satellites. They've got all of these different things that can be helpful to the macro and micro level on climate change, and a real opportunity to sort of be in the middle, figuring out how to implement this at all kinds of different levels. So I would just put in a plug for not overlooking commerce as an important part of this conversation.
Noted. Jim?
Well, I've got a little bit of experience in intergovernmental coordination, and it can work really well. And there's other times it doesn't work really well. Where it works well is if you're focused on a goal and you've got a fairly bite-sized thing you're aiming at. And in this space, it doesn't matter what issue we're talking about. There are 12 agencies in the room, plus all kinds of others in the room. So this is a team sport, and it's a big team sport. Now, if you follow the path that I'm suggesting, it's an easier interagency process. It's a harder set of decisions to pull out, back out, and simplify, okay? Because people are giving up a lot of power in return for a much bigger yield, okay? But that pays off, and that can occur. If you just take the tax set of examples I gave, there's really good effective processes for reaching decision on that and for negotiating that in the Congress. I have no worries about that functioning well if the new president decides they want to go after those three huge areas of unleashing capital for new energy investment. So that one's kind of an easy one. The power plant one is really ugly and hard, but much less ugly and hard than the complete mess of what the Clean Power Plan is causing. By the way, very well intentioned, the best that could be constructed given the statutory tools available, but it's still state by state by state by state, and then these attempts to create regional cap and trade systems to bypass the federal challenges. I mean, it's the ultimate. It's what made the SIP process so challenging that you and I worked on back in the 80s and 90s. We know how that is the least best solution to go after. It's what we've got. Now, if you could just say, all right, wave a flag, say, we get it, it's coming, it's messy, just like we did with air pollution, and just like Bill did with the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990, and say, all right, we see that that's bad, we understand this is what we have to do, let's just do it simple and smart. I think there's common ground in that. And by the way, and then everyone's pointing at simplification as the exercise, not doing all the rent-seeking associated with alternative pathways.
Just one more really quick thing on this, and you talked about it, so this is really parroting you, but the data issue is a big one. And we do, I mean, those of us who do economic research look at the BLS data all the time. We look at the Bureau of Economic Analysis data. We need a data repository that everyone talks about measurement and verification. We need to be able to measure and verify something and then have a repository where we can all access those numbers. Mm-hmm. And that should be a government function. And ideally, it's a cross-administration function. It's not tied to a political agenda.
It won't happen.
Ideally.
Well, that won't happen.
So, Jim, it won't happen, but
So
we all think
those
it
are, by the
should
way,
happen.
I think
So,
it's- I think-
so
I think-
how would you make it happen?
I think it's critical, but the issue is every agency owns their budget and their congressional committee and their particular methodology. It's hard enough to just get 3 of them in the room to try to get them around a consolidated sensitivity
Yeah,
analysis.
but you don't give up, though, do you? I mean, what?
Well, no, I actually think, take cueing off of what Andy Carson said earlier. I mean, the crowd here, is just going to bypass the government process. I don't need the government for that. I mean, everything's getting censored. Everything's being socialized. The data issue is going to be solved out in the world, not in the government. The government may organize it, put some standards around it, but I wouldn't wait for government on the data piece. I want to focus on actions, and let the umpires come in later.
But it does need to be open. The problem is a lot of it's happening in the private sector and is closed. We need some kind of open source, some kind of agreed upon standard here, some benchmarking.
Believe me, if you have something of the scale of what I'm proposing, the measurement methodologies are going to follow, because now you're actually you're choosing the least cost solutions, and there will be a desperation for better measurement technologies, rather than let's wait for the measurement technology before we feel that it can form good actions. By the way, I'm a huge fan of data and measurement verification. Don't get me wrong. It's just if you wait for it, we'll never be there.
So, final question, because we're going to stay on schedule here. But a follow-up, because Jim, you mentioned this, and let's go out to the international ramifications here. And Kate, you talked a lot about, very persuasively, I think, about how some of the bedrock industries are global, and if we can have a cleaner base for them. And so we want industry sectors to be moving toward lower carbon platforms. And somehow we want to get countries that are now making commitments to be able to share information from each other, maybe sectors to be able to work together with leaders helping to set standards and approaches and all of that. And maybe they can also help with the measurement and verification of reduced carbon. So let me ask you first, Jim, because I know you've talked about this a little bit. What do you see as a potential architecture there that might benefit both domestic and international approaches here on a kind of a sector basis?
Well, Secretary Schultz said it correctly. We know how to do this internationally. It was done with the Montreal Protocol. That's an area in which I have also some fair amount of experience, as do you. The construct of that is an annual process that's sector-based and substance-based, by which there is a neutral process of economic reasonability, of technological feasibility of different approaches, and then the economic reasonability of those approaches. They put the two together, and revised goals are set every year. Okay, it's a living process. It's worked. It's quite astounding, and it's caused the fastest, cheapest reductions of a very important pollutant that's also a greenhouse gas. And so that can work. There's been deep resistance to employing that methodology in the climate change process by often the same government negotiators. The ones that are in the Montreal Protocol are the same people that are doing climate change. And yet the process over here is utterly different than the process that's worked over here. I would do no more. And don't tell me it can't be done, because it was done. Don't tell me that the scale of carbon is bigger than ozone. It's more amount, but it's actually fewer sectors, okay, and the capacity to do it. When it comes to power, that's 50% of the problem. We have all the technologies we need today to at least hit the Paris mark. I don't need to invent a single new one to do that. With respect to land use, we have all the technology today to hit the land use mark. That's just government will, good governance, and the things you described, David. And on transportation, we do need some some technology advances, but that's 20%. If I can get 50 plus the 20 on land use, and then get, reap 5 or 10 from transportation on the existing technology stack before we get to the new stuff that Arun and Steve and others have worked on, I don't understand what we're waiting for. I mean, the technologies are there.
Yeah.
Deploy them.
Final word, Kate.
I agree with a lot of that. I think policy, just integration is really important. So I do a lot of work on China now with Hank Paulson. And one thing we're seeing there is this mismatch between air quality and climate goals. So Beijing as a region, the Beijing-Hebei-Shenzhen region has air quality standard goals that they have to meet. And Beijing's mayor, to meet those goals, is moving factories, closing them down in Beijing and moving them to Hebei next door. That meets his air quality goals, that meets the standards, but it doesn't do anything on climate goals. I mean, maybe you get a slightly more efficient factory because it's newer. We have to integrate these goals, and one nice thing about carbon, I mean, it's very challenging, but it also creates for global mechanisms because it is a global problem, much like ozone. You have to look at it globally, and I would just say we have to make sure that those other environmental standards that we're talking about aren't actually in conflict.
Great. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Great.
Thanks, Jim.